Today we have two subject matter experts here to discuss the top 5 lessons learned throughout this momentous year, why they're important, and how to address the challenges each one brings in the future. First, we have Tracy, who joined Telos in October 1986 and serves as Chief Security Officer. He has pioneered the development of innovative and highly scalable enterprise risk management technologies that have become industry-leading solutions within the federal government and the financial services verticals. He is the principal inventor, listed on 5 patents in the area of cyber risk and compliance management. We also have Sydlik, who joined Telos in 2019 and serves as a security engineering. He has 10 years experience in information technology, including cloud computing and cybersecurity in the government, healthcare, and financial sectors. Ryan is a certified information systems security professional, AWS certified solutions architect, and is ITIL certified. With all that said, go ahead and take it away, Rick.
Thank you, Caitlin. On behalf of myself and Ryan, thanks to everyone who's dialed in to listen to this webinar today. As Caitlin mentioned, our objective today is to look a little bit at some lessons learned in the area of risk management over the past 12 months. It's been a crazy year. And we have experienced or observed or noticed some things that we think might be of interest to a broader audience. So that's the point of today's session. Just a little bit about Telos. You can see the top line. We provide advanced technology solutions that empower and protect the world's most security-conscious enterprises. Excuse me, on this slide, you can see just a wide range of sample. Can you go back there? A wide range of sample customers that span technology, cloud, financial services, but also across the bottom, you know, the logos of many federal government agencies where we're very embedded within the Department of Defense, across FedCiv, and the intelligence community. The reason that the Cogswell Award logo is up here is for those of you in the defense industrial base, you might recognize this security award. I think less than 1% of all companies that serve the defense industrial base have received this award, and it's just an indication that security is part of our corporate DNA. Next slide, please. So the point of today is to talk about 5 areas of lessons learned, things that we think will be interesting to other people. As a format, what I plan to do is maybe set the stage for these topics, and Ryan will hit, because he's much smarter than me, will deal with the more detailed nuances in these areas, and I'll add in as we go. So you can see that there are wide range of topics that we plan to address here.
Yeah, well, Rick, you invented a lot of the products. I haven't done that, so I'd put the smarts on you.
Okay, next slide. Next slide. So the pandemic changed a lot, right? The adoption of cloud and digital transformation has accelerated for many companies, and for those who had business continuity plans and anticipated in their business continuity plans things like pandemic, maybe those companies were more prepared. But if you didn't have a business continuity plan and didn't have a pandemic plan, you might have gotten caught short and felt the need to move to the cloud in a more hastily way than you would have otherwise done, without understanding some of the potential pitfalls and the technology required to manage cloud resources. And so in some ways, cloud was a blessing because it was there. But in other ways, for some organizations, it could have presented risk that didn't exist prior to the pandemic. So we're going to talk a little bit about cloud adoption, and this is where I'm going to hand it over to Ryan to talk a little bit more in detail about that.
Well, the change in planned cloud usage it's definitely measurable. For larger companies, 60% of companies had slightly higher usage than planned due to COVID-19, and 29% had significantly higher than planned. And what I find really interesting is the small and medium businesses, which was 52% had slightly higher usage. And then for 34%, which is more than of the enterprises, they had significantly higher usage than planned, spend than planned. So I found that really fascinating. But obviously, you can see here that by far for most companies, the pandemic completely accelerated this trend rather than stopping it or slowing it down. For public cloud adoption, this is the point where 99% of organizations, at least within the scope of what we looked at, use at least one public or private cloud, which is essentially everyone. And of those, 97% use a public cloud and 80% use a private cloud. I'm just a bit surprised to see that. I thought it might be the other way, where more organizations use a private cloud and more use a public. But if you think about it, it makes sense. A public cloud has a lot more flexibility. So, I guess I should have thought it would have been this way after all. Obviously, you can see the vendor adoption, but the important thing is you can see AWS, you can see Azure, but there's a lot of different clouds out there. So it's not just AWS, it's not just Azure with Google. You have VMware in the cloud space, Oracle, IBM, and then for international customers, you have Alibaba. So the point is, there's a lot of different platforms out there. It's not just one or two. So it's one thing to say, oh, I spent significantly more on cloud, or I spent a lot more on cloud, or I spent a little bit on cloud. It's really reflected in the spending. So one statistic was very interesting is the number of organizations that spent at least 12 million per year doubled in 2020 from 16% to 31%. So out of all of the organizations that were looked at in this report, 16% of them went up to $12 million in spend, which is huge. So if you want to quantify that number, make sure this is a real thing and not just somebody expressing their frustrations in a survey. It's quantifiable in millions of dollars. And with that, you get into the security pieces. People are moving to cloud. So as people are accelerating their drive to the cloud, what are the attackers doing to find entry points? I got this information from SEI, the Software Engineering Institute at Carnegie Mellon. These are some risks they identified that seem to make a lot of sense. Some of these are very specific to the cloud. Some of these are both cloud and on-prem, but are probably easier to exploit in the cloud. So the first kind of entry point, so to speak, is reduced visibility and control. And what this means is that because organizations need to account for inheritance and providers and managed services providers, they don't necessarily see everything they're doing. If it's an on-premise system, you kind of, by definition, control it 100%. If you're in the cloud, you just don't have access to everything. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, one is that you have the inheritance model where either your cloud provider, whether it's AWS or Azure, or your managed service provider on top of that is doing a lot for you. So you just don't see what's going on, and you have to get that visibility, especially if you have an MSP. In the case of Amazon and Azure, sometimes you just have to trust that that's going on, and you can do that through, they've passed all kinds of assessments and gotten all kinds of certifications. That's how you know that. But the other thing is you have reduced visibility and control simply because it's just very different. Most organizations are used to looking at things in an on-prem manner, and then you go to cloud and they have these different cloud accounts for maybe their different business units. It's all scattered. So you really need to get new tools to get visibility into it. So in addition to the inherent loss of some visibility, there's just some visibility and control loss simply because it's new and you have to learn how to do your security in the cloud. On-demand self-service, it simplifies as unauthorized use. So one thing about the cloud that's great is you can provision new services far easier. I mean, you can stand up servers, VMs in minutes, or even whole infrastructures with things like CloudFormation. However, one thing you have to be really careful here is that if somebody were to get into your environment, they could do the same thing. So two very popular things for being exploited in the cloud are either crypto mining or botnets, where an attacker will launch all kinds of instances, VMs, maybe even Lambda jobs if they're tricky enough. And they can go in and spend all kinds of your money, and then they could either mine crypto and take that for themselves, or they can set up botnets to scam or attack other people. Or they could even provision these services in an insecure way where they could break into your other accounts. So that's something you have to be very careful with because, it's very hard to drive a truck up to a data center and just put some servers in if you if you're an attacker. But with cloud, it's not that hard of a thing to do if you don't, especially if the proper security controls aren't applied. So compromise management APIs. Obviously, in modern systems, it's very API based. You have APIs for management, orchestration, monitoring, and you have these on premise too. But the thing about the cloud is, by definition, it has to be accessible over the internet. So what threat actors will do is look for firewall misconfigurations or vulnerabilities in the APIs. So you have to make sure you take control of these APIs. You need to make sure that you have, your APIs, if there's certain ones that are activated, that they get alerted if they're used, or also if they're, in addition to alerting the APIs, just your proper firewalls to limit your IP addresses and limit access to the IP addresses where these APIs might be present. And the other thing you have to worry about too with APIs is that, especially with deployment software, those things are hitting a lot of IP addresses. They need to talk to a lot of different things. Like, let's say you're using a Jenkins pipeline. Well, that's going to be wide open because it's talking to so many different IP addresses. You really need to be careful with these because they're very promiscuous. They talk to a lot of things. So you really need to make sure you either turn them off when you're not using them, or just have a very good, know your ports very well and block them, or apply a lot of different other solutions. It's a very tricky problem to manage. Separation among multiple tenants. Thankfully, this one's been theoretical so far. I mean, what this would be is if not a cloud user, not a cloud customer was hacked, but the cloud itself was hacked. And as far as documented cases that are out in the open, we're not aware of any of these. And again, what would happen in this case is someone breaks into one account, one tenant, and they break into all the other ones using some kind of flaw, whether, within the cloud provider itself. And this is one reason why cloud's been considered secure, is this hasn't happened yet. So thankfully, we're in a good spot. And obviously, the big cloud providers, they provide a lot of time and energy that they don't really talk about to making sure the cloud's secure. But at the same time, if this is a low probability event, it is also a high risk event if any kind of break-in were to ever occur. So you need to understand.
Hey, Ryan.
Go ahead.
Hey, Ryan. Just conceptually, this notion of logical separation versus physical separation has a tendency to freak people out, whether
Yes.
it's real or theoretical. It's just some people have a hard time getting their head around it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's one of those things that, there might be some physical separation, but there's definitely a lot of logical separation. And that's why cloud, it does have certain big leaders, is they've been able to figure this out. But yeah, it's definitely hard to wrap your head around. But the important thing is, for this to happen, you need to know what you're getting from the cloud provider and what, you're doing yourself. So, if you get a notification that something's gone wrong, can you take action to fix it, to do something to mitigate the damage? Likewise, obviously if something happens to yourself, you can't go to your cloud provider and say, hey, this is wrong, can you fix it? Well, they can't. They don't have that control. So it's really understanding what you're inheriting from your cloud provider to help deal with this problem. And again, it's a fascinating one. If it ever does occur, it'll be huge news. But again, it hasn't occurred yet, but we have to think about it. Data deletion incomplete. One of the major advantages of the cloud is your multiple redundancies with data. Like, you can have so many, multiple versions of things in S3 buckets and folders. You can have snapshots of all your resources. So because your data is backed up in so many different places, it's easy to delete something and forget about it in the other locations. So you need to go ahead and, when you're deleting data, you have to make sure you understand every single place where it might be. It's not as simple as just, deleting a file and wiping a hard drive. There's just a lot of different places for it to live. And the other issue is that there's certain things you just can't do with the cloud. You cannot, for example, shred hard drives when you're done because, you just don't have access to them. So you just need to have, additional logical controls because you don't have the physical controls you might have in an on-premise area. The next ones, they're not unique risks to the cloud. They occur in on-premise as well, but they're still kind of inherent and, might be magnified a bit. Stolen credentials can happen with anything to anybody. But the cloud's accessible over the internet, so there's a greater risk here. You have to use the internet to have the cloud to some degree. I mean, again, there's certain private clouds and whatnot. But if you're talking about public cloud, you're a commercial organization, you're going to be over the internet. So you have to guard against this risk. Increased complexity. What I like to say is that there's a difference between a pyramid and a battery. You would think a battery is easier to build than a pyramid than it is, but at the same time, pyramids became before batteries. And it's kind of like that with on-premise before cloud. On-premise is more inefficient, but it's less complex, whereas cloud is a lot more efficient, but it's super complex. So cloud, and if anybody's confused about my analogy, just let me know. But that's kind of what I like to say is that with greater efficiency, you always need greater complexity. So cloud simplifies, again, a lot of things, especially from you as an organization. You don't have to worry about, for example, any hardware, or you don't have to worry, a lot of configurations done automatically for you. But at the same time, understanding the relationship between your accounts, your tenants can be much more difficult. Or the other natural disadvantage you have is with on-premise systems, people have experience. With mainframes, you can go back 30 years, more than that. With your traditional server architecture, you could have somebody 20 years, 30 years experience. I mean, with cloud, nobody's really going to have more than 10 years experience because it's so new. So, we just don't have that all accumulated knowledge yet. We need to understand, do we train people? Do we hire people? How do we just learn more about it to take advantage of the efficiencies despite it being more complex? And then finally, insider threat. The power to create is the power to destroy. Capability to stand up resources in minutes also is the capability to destroy data in seconds. So access controls need to be applied carefully to minimize and reduce this risk. So with cloud, I think you can put in better access controls than you can on-prem. If you take ownership, you can control it much better. But if you don't, things can go bad really quickly. So moving ahead, cloud-based technologies will modernize everything from the workplace to healthcare and to education and IT. Organizations have to plan to leverage the cloud in a secure and compliant manner. You just can't ignore it anymore. Security risks must be addressed. The cloud is not a plug-and-play solution. It has different challenges. If you try to do the exact same things you do on on-premise in cloud, either it's not going to work or you're not going to get the efficiency, and it's probably going to be both. So, if you're going to a better platform, you want it to be better. Cloud is here. It's not going away. It's only going to grow. And then how are you going to deal with this complexity? Are you going to hire, train people? Probably both. Are you going to try and do it yourself or get contract professionals? Are you going to develop your own tools or are you going to buy them?
So the only thing that I would add is how we got to this topic is the rapid adoption of cloud, and maybe it's been too hasty for some, and you really have to move into this environment with your eyes wide open. You have to know what the limitations are. You need to understand the various cloud vendors' shared responsibility models so that you know what you have to do versus what they have to do. The way that many people adopted the cloud this past year was out of necessity, and maybe there were some hard lessons learned by those organizations. But to Ryan's point, the cloud is here to stay, and we have to learn how to leverage it. And I think it's going to require just a little bit more effort on the part of organizations who are largely familiar with on-prem IT solutions.
Yep. I will say this, though, it might have been hasty, but it saved a lot of people a lot of stress that they otherwise, it was stressful at the time, but it enabled us to do something that was a lot more safe and unprecedented in social distancing. So,
Totally. Yep.
With that, the security probably came second. For many people, your life's more important. So do it the safe way, but now we got to get the cyber safety piece done. So cyber supply really matters, or cyber supply chain really matters. Recent high-profile breaches have highlighted the importance of cybersecurity chain risk management. Prior to SolarWinds, most people didn't pay attention to it. The risk has always been there. It's not new. NIST has talked about it for at least 5 years, but it's grown enormously. So I'll just talk about a few aspects of the supply chain we have to worry about. The one is the human element. Social engineering, especially phishing emails, are a risk to any system. And this includes digital supply chains. So the same things that you're affecting everything else are affecting supply chains as well, and they're only increasing in scope. Critical data. Here's the interesting thing is people have talked about security for a while now. So if an organization's responsible, they've subjected their data to direct protections. They've put up their firewalls. They've done their due diligence. They've done their audits. They've got their continuous monitoring. So you might be a hard target now. So in this case, indirect methods need to be tried and exploited. So one of these is the supply chain. If you have a supplier that's not as hardened as you, it's a way in. The example here was for Target. The attackers, when the Target breach occurred a few years ago, they couldn't get in through, say, the e-commerce system, so they went for the HVAC system. So you'd think, oh yeah, we got our e-commerce secure, great. But if you come in through another method, that's a way in that may not be as hardened, because as we get better at this, the attackers will find other ways. Third party and weak links. This is one that we're seeing in the physical world. You saw it with the pipeline hack. You've seen it with supply. I mean, it can be either direct attacks or it could be just marketplace issues. You see it with computer chips and automobiles. You see it with chicken meat right now. I mean, we've come to realize our supply chains are dependent on certain rate limiters that if they disappear, everything stops. So this makes it really hard for security, because you might only have a few suppliers to choose from, and it's already limited. If you have 2 or 3 suppliers, how do you make them, how do you force them to be secure with yourself? So you really need to negotiate with that. I mean, the only way I can see this really being done is that you have multiple consumers of supply chains getting together saying, hey, when we work with you to get our supplies to us, we need to make sure it's done in a secure manner. So it's just a fascinating problem. It doesn't have an easy answer. And the other thing is it requires multilinear thinking, and that needs additional tracking. People can be very much into themselves, think about their own organization, but they don't think about everybody else that works with them. So you just need to think a little differently on this, and people don't have a tendency to do that. And finally, the lack of vendor risk management. Keeping up with risk management in your organization is a fatiguing challenge in and of itself, which we'll talk about later in this slide. And tracking of vendors, you need additional resources. So it might very well be, you might have had 16 audits you had to pass in a year, and let's say you passed them all. And then somebody comes up, you want to take a break, you want to go just relax, hit up the beach, go sleep in the hammock, whatever, you did a good job. And then somebody comes up to you and says, oh, you got to do this for everybody else that's supplying you. I mean, people just want to like freak out over that. So, to solve this, you have to look at, maybe bringing economies of scale. You've done it for yourself. Let's repeat the process for all our vendors. But again, this is just something that, people are already fatigued about protecting themselves. And then now you got to worry about all these vendors. You might have had a good risk program for yourself or a decent one, but now you got to expand it, several times just to account for everybody else that you're working with. So moving ahead, the third-party risk standards aren't new, but they're more relevant than ever. NIST has been promoting cyber supply chain risk management for more than 5 years via the standards such as 800-161, 853, and NIST CSF. The executive order on improving the nation's cybersecurity, which was signed on May 12th, has something to say about this. Rick can talk about that. And then obviously any organization would be well advised to include SCRM into their cyber risk management workstream. Moral of the story, nothing is new, but it's just, it's finally blown up to where what we should have been thinking about years ago. I say use an appropriate standard, and you got to have GRCs and other tools to keep up. And then Rick, if you've got anything else on the executive order.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is if there's any good news that came out of SolarWinds is I think it shined a bright spotlight on supply chain risk management, but not at the level that we've been thinking about it. It's more focused on software supply chain risk management. 25% of the roughly 8,000 words in the executive order, in some way, shape, or form, focused on supply chain risk management, and we quote unquote have SolarWinds, I think, to thank for that. So supply chain risk management is something that it has been really important. It's been largely ignored, I think. But the executive order is going to shine more light on it, and it's going to extend the requirement to software solutions so that software vendors build minimum security standards into their products so that these technologies can't be used as Trojan horses in much the way SolarWinds was in the breach that we saw last year.
Yes.
I think I think you covered everything else, Ryan.
All right, so not all systems are created equal. That's number 3. In the past, most systems were hosted on-prem. In fact, in the past, if we go back far enough, all of them were hosted on-premise. Recently, organizations were moved to hybrid and multi-cloud systems. So of this, the survey, this Flexera survey, 78% of organizations surveyed use hybrid cloud, a mixture of public cloud. So, in which hybrid cloud is a mixture of public and private cloud, which is a big number using a hybrid. And it's interesting, well, many startups are totally cloud. I mean, that's probably the 19%. There's a lot of organizations that say, if you started a company within the past 3 years, you might be all cloud. You might be, all smooth sailing. And then likewise, if you're very security conscious organizations, or not that being security conscious limits you to private cloud, you might be better off going with public, but certain organizations, just for whatever reason, they just use private clouds only. But again, this really, what I said before, 97 to 99% of all organizations are using some kind of cloud right now. And what this is leading to is that the point is 70% are hybrids, 19% are public only, 2% are private. So that means for most people, it's 78%. You have to worry about this hybrid problem. You can't just say, oh, I'm going to secure my public cloud, or I'm going to secure my private cloud. You have to deal with both. And you have to deal with your on-premise system as well. So
yeah, what it serves to do is just increase the complexity of the systems that we all rely on day to day to run our business. As if on-prem wasn't hard enough to manage by itself.
yes.
So this cloud adoption, not just cloud but multi-cloud, and certain industries are requiring organizations within those industries, and I'm thinking about financial services in particular, are requiring use of multiple clouds to distribute the risk across multiple cloud environments, which is great from a risk standpoint, perhaps, but it doesn't help the system management complexity that is created by that decision. So,
yeah.
Sure.
And likewise, you can end up with these hybrid. You can end up with hybrid public clouds too. For example, let's say you have, let's say you want to, do a web application. Let's say you want a web application that's Oracle based. Well, you might want to use Amazon Web Services for your application side. Then you're an Oracle customer, so you're going to use Oracle because you're going to get the better database deal there if you're an Oracle, customer. And then you realize, oh, well, I got to use Active Directory. Well, I'm going to use AD. I might as well go with Microsoft. So that you can have a hybrid cloud real easy, just because you're trying to leverage certain advantages of each one. And it's very easy to either fall into that, or maybe you want to choose that for the right reasons. So the point is hybrid cloud is one of those things that if you're big enough, you're going to be hybrid. You can't really change that, in my mind. Like once you get into a certain size, you have to be hybrid. So moving ahead, these complex environments make cyber risk management even more complex than it was before. One enterprise and one goal of keeping it secure. I mean, with security, it's always one goal. Make sure the data doesn't get exploited. Make sure the system is available. It's all one thing. It doesn't change from cloud to cloud. But with many disparate clouds and on-premise systems, it can break that up. And again, one enterprise should be doing all one thing. But with many different clouds out there, there's many different pieces you have to wrangle in. So it's important to understand this through the complex cyber risk management function. So with asset management, in the past, you might have had Tivoli to do something, or BMC. You might manage your assets in one tool. Well, it's very difficult to do that if you have a hybrid cloud, so you have to integrate your various asset management tools. And that can be anything from AWS SSM to, again, some of the traditional on-premise tools we know of. And trying to get that all in one place is extremely hard. Control validation. This can be very difficult because, well, controls are different. Like if you're using AWS versus Azure, there's different controls there. If you're using on-premise controls, there's different control sets there. If you're using a private cloud, well, there's still controls that exist there, even though, you have less control over that system. You still have to worry about certain controls. So when you have controls that are just so spread out in various platforms, it's hard to bring them together in one place. With continuous monitoring, that's another challenge, because if you're not only trying to get your ATO once every 3 years, but trying to make sure that daily or monthly or weekly that everything, that you're keeping your baseline, trying to do this on multiple platforms becomes a great challenge. It's really be nice to have a tool that puts everything together. With the risk remediation, it's another issue. It can be hard to figure out the risk. Traditionally, if you had something that was a risk, but you had something compensating, then you could say, oh, this isn't as bad of a risk. But if you have multiple clouds, it can be very hard to determine, how strong that risk is, because you have so many pieces. Like, all right, if I'm using Azure, AWS, and GCP, and I get a flaw in one, and then it's mapped to other accounts that I have in another cloud, what is the risk on that? It's a very difficult problem to solve. And then finally, policies and procedures. You generally want to have one policy. I mean, maybe you'll have a certain policy for on-premise versus public versus private, but generally your policy is going to be the same thing. But then you need to have different procedures that you have to write for every single entity out there that you're using. So that can be very challenging. Likewise, you might come up with a policy, it sounds great, and then it breaks down when you move from one platform to another. I mean, you might have something that's great for on-premise, but then you take it to the cloud, it just doesn't make any sense. So you have to understand, when you're coming up with policies, do these apply to everything? Do I have to adjust them for my different clouds? It's an interesting problem to figure out, and that's why I think GRC tools would be very helpful for that.
Yeah, I would just add to that. If you were to net out that last section, Ryan, the basic point is you really have to have a strategy for managing these complex environments, which includes tooling that works for the various environments that comprise your network. But I think we can't reinforce enough the need to understand the various cloud vendors' shared responsibility model, so that you understand what your responsibilities are as you're moving things into these different environments. So understanding and strategy and investment for the complex environments as they evolve are like really critical as we move forward.
All right, audit fatigue is a killer. So the audit fatigue study. Telos has several customers dealing with audit fatigue. And I want to mention it this way because we didn't just go out and commission this study because we thought, oh, we have a product that can solve this. Let's just do a study on it and see what we get. It was more the other way around, where customers are coming to us and saying, hey, we've got this problem. Can you help us deal with it? So based on that, we decided, if certain customers are having this problem, a lot of the other ones we have are probably having it as well. So we commissioned an independent market research agency, Vance & Bourne, to conduct audit fatigue research in July and August of 2020. The study surveyed 300 IT security professionals from American organizations with 1,000 plus employees in the private sector. What did we find? So we found that the ongoing release of new regulations that have teeth. So these regulations aren't just suggestions anymore. You can get fined, you can lose business over them. So audit fatigue weakens the overall cybersecurity of the enterprise. So teams working in a high operational tempo, it's just not sustainable. Multiple ongoing requests for audit evidence, both internal and external. I mean, that can be very grating if you have both internal and external auditors asking for evidence at different times, or just very different kinds of evidence. It can be very hard to keep up. Requires highly skilled, highly compensated, difficult to replace professionals. Artifacts needed for audit evidence are widely distributed and hard to track down. I mean, this can be a huge issue. Like you might have something might be under control of your network operations center. Something else might be in your business units. Something else might be under data science. Some of your controls might be in HR or your training department. There's a lot of different people you have to go knocking on doors to find. And it's hard, especially in a remote environment, to do that sometimes. And then finally, audits are addressed individually as a whole. Do you really want to have 16 different audits thrown at you, or do you want to do one big one? I mean, most people would probably choose one bigger, higher quality audit. This is quantifiable. Organizations spend over $3.5 million each year on activities related to IT security compliance and/or privacy regulations. And if an industry is considered heavily regulated, this increases to $4.7 million. Every organization operating today is subject to IT security compliance and privacy regulations. As more and more regulations come into existence, organizations are struggling to keep pace. 13 is the average number of different IT security compliance and or privacy regulations with which organizations that were the scope of the survey must comply. 22 is the average number of dedicated staff required to manage various IT security compliance and or privacy regulations. And the interesting thing about that is if there's 22 dedicated staff, there's probably at least 44 people that it's not their official job to do this, but they're getting hit by these requests constantly, and they're not able to do their day jobs to answer these. So, 22 is one number, but, I look at the numbers that we don't see sometimes as being even worse. A few other things to note. Go ahead.
The other thing to focus on is the 13, the average number of compliance requirements. With the introduction of policy requirements at each state, Virginia just introduced theirs, California has one, And probably most of the 50 states are talking about introducing their own privacy requirements. That number 13 for a lot of companies is going to go through the roof as they begin to pile on the redundant, overlapping privacy requirements on top of what they're already doing. So the challenge is going to be to deal with that number 13 as it doubles or triples, and hopefully have that number 22 go down. And the only way to achieve that is through automation.
Yes, absolutely. So other things from the study, 4 out of 5 security professionals report dread when their organization is audited. That's not surprising, but I honestly wonder who the 1 in 5 are. Anyway, with that, is there anything that can be done to reduce that? Even if it's 3 in 5, that's a huge win. If you get it to 1 in 5, that'd be like paradise. But let's say we get it down a little bit more. Likewise, 9 in 10 believe compliance is or will be an issue for moving to the cloud. So again, can we get that number down a little bit? And then 84% of organizations report that the processes they use for audits are time consuming. This is one where I really, wonder who are these other, let's say the other 15%. I mean, I'm sure some organizations have this down to a science, but most of them don't. This is still kind of a new thing, still kind of a new field. And even for organizations that are mature in it, you can always get better. So the point is these processes are extremely time consuming. And then another very interesting thing we found was that those that were found non-compliant within the last 24 months received average fines of more than $460,000. So not only is $460,000 bad, maybe a large company can afford that, but the reputation hit you'll take for getting that's going to be even worse, in my opinion. So, if you're getting $460,000 in fines, do you really want to do business with a company that has that? I surely wouldn't. What do organizations rather be doing? Well, everything. The one thing I'd like to say is that compliance is sort of like getting a good grade, and cybersecurity is sort of like learning the material. There's a lot of different things, whether it's research, data analysis, but if you can reduce the time that you're doing for compliance, reduce the effort, then that's more time that your security professionals can do to, discovering new things or gaining insights or learning about security. So, even once you can get your compliance needs met, you do that more efficiently, you can focus on some of the weirder cybersecurity problems that are harder to nail down in a compliance type of audit. But the point is, rather than auditing, we'd all rather be doing something else. Moving ahead, embracing automation. Well, it has to be that way. There's just too much coming out of the fire hose. Focus on maturity, not just compliance. That's the way to do it, because you're complying with a standard. It's not always enough. You can comply with that standard, but it really has to be ingrained with the organization. And that's everybody. If it's just compliance, it doesn't filter into the organization. If you're focusing on maturity, then that's the whole organization's buying in. Centralized communication repository for body of evidence across teams. I mean, this is important. This should be centrally stored. There's no reason it shouldn't be, because then you should duplicative effort, rework. You might have inconsistent findings, which that's a problem to try and explain to somebody. So you want to have a centralized body of evidence. Concise asset inventory and definition of critical systems. I mean, everything should be defined properly, because if you don't understand what's there, or if you don't understand how it works, or you don't understand all the pieces, that's something you'll miss, and then an assessor can fine you for that, or they can make a finding for that. Mapping across multiple organizations. Why not just test once and comply with many? Something applies to many different standards. Once you've solved it for one, you've solved it for the rest, or maybe you've mostly solved it, then you got to get a few little pieces. It's a lot less time consuming. Utilizing controls for inheritance. You want to understand, if you're already buying a cloud service, you're already paying for them to do the controls for you. Or if you're already using an MSP, you're already paying them to do their work so that your controls are met. So if they're doing that for you, you can just provide evidence that they're doing that. They've been already certified, whether it's a 3PO process or something else. You provide that evidence, and then you're in the clear. Likewise, you might assume that you're doing things they're not doing. So you have to discover, oh wait, my cloud provider is not, providing X and X security service. I need to do that myself and figure that out. And of course, enforcing and automating continuous monitoring. Continuous monitoring, if it's not automated, doesn't really exist. So again, 99% of professionals believe that their organization would benefit or would be interested in an automated solution to manage audits. Again, I wonder who that 1% is. But if you have an automated solution, that's going to save everybody's time. Establish a framework. Lack of consistency in basic cyber hygiene have resulted in breaches, both major and minor. The GAO report on critical infrastructure protection highlighted this. There's a need for more structured cyber risk and compliance management. That's, I think, a given, but it's always good to talk about. And there's lots of reasons, despite frameworks being needed, why they might not be adopted. One is organizational resistance. This has to be navigated. You have to address it, and you can't ignore it. This is where a tool becomes really important because it provides a continuous objective source to justify the framework. If you're going to enforce anything, you have to be able to understand what it is. Like, it's hard to enforce a law if nobody knows it's there. So if the framework is in every, if it's clearly visible, accessible, and clearly communicated, and consistent, then that's something you can go to people that are resisting it, adopting a framework, and say, this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it, this is why we have to do it. Lack of goals. Adopting a framework without an objective is foolish. You need to consider adoption so you can meet compliance requirements imposed on you. I mean, one thing that would be awful that I've seen before is that if you cherry pick, I'm going to take this control from one source, this one from another, and I'll get something. It doesn't work that way. These standards are standards for a reason. They all work, the standard works together to provide one good, clear picture. So you definitely want to pick a standard or pick standards. And again, you have to know which ones might be imposed on you. If you're in a financial organization, understand the financial standards might apply. If you're a government organization, you have to understand those. So figure out what you would have to comply with because someone else tells you to. And if it's not imposed, or if you want to go deeper, then you pick one that makes more sense for your organization. Go ahead and see which ones, see which ones might work. In this case, if you're not sure, go with NIST because it's very generic, it's very broad. But you want to make sure that whatever framework you're using makes sense for your organization. Lack of tools is an issue. So if you know the technology meets your needs, you have to know what you're buying and determine if the tool will help you with the standardization. It's not good to just, there's two bad ways of doing this. The worst is to buy nothing and just stay manual. That doesn't work. The other thing that's almost as bad is where you buy a bunch of stuff and then you don't, implement it properly, or it doesn't really do as much as you thought it did, or it does a lot of things that you don't need. So you have to start with tools, and you have to make sure before you start with tools that you understand what they're doing and what they're providing and how they work together. That's the other factor. It's one thing to buy a couple tools and realize they don't work together very well. So you really need to plan what kind of tools you're buying and how each of them works together. And then, of course, change management. I just bring this up because adopting a framework will result in a lot of changes for your organization. So just make sure your change management process, as part of, standards, you have to update it a lot of times, but, even before doing that, make sure you have a good change management process so you can implement the changes you'll need to make.
Ryan, I would just say on this slide, one of the things I think we've noticed is that there's a framework adoption just hasn't been a priority for a lot of the reasons that you mentioned. And I think absent the use of frameworks and the consistency and repeatability that they deliver result in the sort of breaches that we've seen over the past however many years,
yeah.
Right? Because a lot of just basic cybersecurity, I hate to use the word hygiene, but just basic practices can be identified if they're not there. You can develop you can prioritize and develop a remediation plan. But if you don't have a framework that is consistent about what you're measuring yourself against, i.e. security controls, and you don't have a process for validating security controls, assessing business impact based on control failures, establishing remediation plans that help you achieve remediation over some period of time, who does what by when, you're just shooting yourself in the foot, to be truthful. And if for anyone who's interested, I know, reading government reports doesn't sound like it's interesting, but for anyone who's interested in frameworks, this GAO report is really interesting because it talks about how much hope there was for the cybersecurity framework, but the lack of adoption and lack of consistent reporting doesn't really give anybody any data to work with in terms of effectiveness, consistency of implementation, areas where the framework could be improved to be more effective. So anyway, it'd be a nice night reading exercise to read that GAO report.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, the kinds of organizational resistance. Sometimes it might just be lack of priority. You can solve that. Or it might be sometimes in an organization, people have different ideas what frameworks they want to implement. They might say, oh, we're an industrial organization, let's do ISO, or we're, but no, this is for security, let's do NIST. So you can have that kind of resistance. Sometimes it'd be very nefarious resistance. It could be that, and maybe a business unit knows they're going to be really bad if they get some sunlight on it. So that's a whole different kind of problem. So we have to also identify why that resistance is occurring and then fix that. Sometimes it's better communication. Sometimes it requires more of a, it's just more of a serious nefarious problem you got to deal with. So understand why that resistance is occurring. You want people to adopt the framework. You want them to realize it's good for the organization. So, if you convince them of that, that's great. If they can't be convinced of that for a certain reason, then, that's a whole nother issue you got to deal with in a very strong way. So pick a framework. Like I said before, NIST is a good one if you're not sure. You should always know why you're picking a framework, but if it's one that, if you're really kind of like, if you got a couple or you're on the fence, go with NIST. Obviously, if you're dealing with in government agencies, definitely good to go with NIST. You'll need to do it anyway because you'll have to comply with it. And then something like 20 countries outside the US have adopted the cybersecurity framework as well. So is that CSF or Cloud Security Framework or Cybersecurity Framework, Rick?
Cybersecurity framework.
Okay, cybersecurity framework.
Yeah, and that's a Gartner, I'm sorry, that's a NIST statistic.
Yep. Yeah, because I'm also aware of the cloud security frameworks out there as well. But yeah, the cybersecurity framework. And then obviously RMF is a huge one. So the point being is that if you're in the government industry, go with it because you're going to need to. And even if you're not, it's probably going to give you some benefits. You want to operationalize the framework so you have consistency. They just can't be document chases. You want to set clear objectives and goals. These almost have to be incremental. You can't just say, oh, we're going to do NIST in one big thing. It doesn't work that way. So just figure out what steps you need and then take them. Use technology that meets your needs and can assist with implementation and workflow automation. And then finally, just have a centralized record of evidence for standard of care. It's good for your references. You can refer back to it. And then also, if you have a good record, then that's evidence you're doing a good job. So I think everybody should have that. So getting into the Telos solutions, and then Rick, I'll let you handle this one.
Yeah, sure. We're running short on time, Ryan. We'll leave room for questions. So if you just go to the next slide.
Okay.
This is not intended to be a commercial, but as you might anticipate, Xacta addresses a lot of the issues that we've talked about for the past 45 minutes. And if you're interested in how we can help with managing complex environments or mapping security controls to reduce audit fatigue and operationalizing frameworks, these are areas where we specialize. And I'll leave it at that. If you're interested, we're happy to have a conversation. So I think, Caitlin, we're going to open it up to questions now.
Absolutely. First of all, thank you both for the presentation. It's awesome. The chat box is open for anybody who'd like to submit questions, but we did have the opportunity to submit them in the registration form. So we'll run through some of those. Anything we don't address, we'll hand off to the sales team and they can contact you or you can contact them. But I'll go ahead and get started here with one question submitted. How is Telos responding to the rise of containers?
Well, on the Xacta.io side, we're discussing future integration with container scanning solutions, so we can pull data from container scanning in container scanners, like what we're doing with VM platforms at this time to test controls. So the point is there are container scanning solutions out there. We're planning on integrating with those.
All right. Another one here, disruption of the OS server model for compute infrastructure. Everything we do is key to the idea that we can just pull for the OS or its configuration settings or stick an agent on it. We haven't directly tested for vulnerabilities in decades. We just look for the patch date on the binaries or in the registry. How do we test an application in a container in production? Is it even possible to patch it without sending it back to development?
couple ways I'd say you can do this, and then Rick, if you got any other ideas, let me know. But obviously the container scanners are being released now. You can kind of see what's going on and then go from there. The obvious thing is if you scan your AMIs before deploying, I mean, that's a very common way of doing it. So if if you're about to deploy your AMI, you scan it and then you resolve those before it ever goes in production. And then of course, obviously things change all the time. So the best thing to do is eventually it does have to go back through dev, but that's why you have a DevOps pipeline. You try to make that as efficient as you can so that when you do new deployments that it's less burdensome. But the point is scan your AMIs, or your machine images, your VMs, whatever you want to call them for different clouds, and then scan it before and then have it do its thing. And then, when you have to deploy another one, you make that process simple. So it's less work on your dev team.
All right. Another one here, how do you prioritize threat mitigation?
For example, Exacta 360 and Exacta.io have risk calculation features. So you want to prioritize threats to mitigate. There's ways of doing this. So it's basically, if you have something and help calculate that for you, you see what threats are the best, and then you just address them one by one until you hit the end of your list.
I would only add there that I think it's important to understand the impact on the business that the risk presents, so that you can prioritize it. You don't want to spend a bunch of time remediating a risk that poses little or no risk to the organization. So it's all about business risk. And I think if anything, this past year has shown us that cybersecurity really is a business risk, not just a technology issue. And so the only thing that I would add is it's mapping impact to the business, so you can prioritize accordingly.
All right. And are you seeing a slow adoption of cyber risk management from businesses? And what role does that play in the larger theme of things?
Well, at least in the past few months, I've seen the opposite. But what happens now, it's like a flood and a mad dash due to newsworthy breaches. You need to do risk mitigation methodically and in a controlled manner. So I'm seeing fast adoption, but the problem is people are struggling to do it, or they're throwing everything at it and they're just not doing it in a way where it's controlled. You just need to settle down and take it on in a manner where you're confident in what you're doing. So hopefully we get to that point where people are confident in implementing cyber risk management, because right now they're not. Right now it's a panic.
And right now I'd say that a lot of it's being done with Excel spreadsheets and email, and that's not the key to success. We've talked about the importance of platforms to automate frameworks and make them institutionalized across an enterprise. So I think maybe organizations have to learn the lesson that Excel, as good as that tool is, it's not an appropriate enterprise cyber risk management platform.
Yeah, I like to say Excel is never a business process. It's something to understand a business process, or something to communicate information, but it is not a business process in and of itself.
All right. Another one here, with exchange hacks discovered by CISA on January 6th and Office 365 issues now, what is true opportunity cost staying on-prem?
Well, I was trying to understand the context of this question. I'm going to assume that it's comparing on-prem versus cloud as far as opportunity costs. And I'll say the opportunity cost of staying on-premise is almost always a loss. The only times I've seen on-premises be cost competitive with the cloud is if you have like a very weird non-standard use case, and if you have top-notch talent that can wear a lot of hats. Like in those cases, it might make sense to be on-prem. But if you're doing something that's like a business as usual, I don't see any advantage of staying on-premise at this point. The economies of scale just in the cloud are too good. And the other thing is, if you're going to do some kind of be it business as usual, go way back and still in use right now is mainframes. The problem with mainframes is the talent is hard to find. So if you're in an on-premise scenario of mainframes, the other problem is that in addition to people where you're literally calling somebody that's like 65 plus to come in and fix a bunch of systems, just because these people are ready to retire and they just keep getting called in because they're getting money thrown at them, there's lots of reasons for that. I don't want to get into that, but the point is the talent isn't there like it used to be. And obviously there's a lot more development in your traditional x86 type architectures. But the other problem with mainframes is that even if you're using them, they're really expensive. And you might need them for high, IO operations, some kind of reliability. There's advantages there. But one thing I've come to understand is that there's so much junk on a lot of on-premise systems, again, especially things like mainframes, and they don't need that reliability. They don't need that high cost, and it's eating so many costs. Whereas with cloud, there's a lot of cheap storage you can utilize. So the point being is that, the on-premise, there's not really a lot of cases where the opportunity cost of staying on-premise is going to help you. It happens, don't get me wrong, but it's not going that way. And the clouds, the longer we go, the cheaper it's going to get.
Yeah, the interesting thing to me is, going back to the Exchange hack, is that, Microsoft indicated that no one who used their cloud-hosted service was impacted. So I didn't know really how to interpret that. Was that their way of saying you need to move to the cloud, or was that more of a commentary on the cyber risk management practices within the organization who choose to host Exchange on-prem?
Yeah, maybe that's what it was meant for. But yeah, I agree with you there. The cloud, I mean, the thing is, if you have a hosted service, it's going to be patched automatically. If it's Exchange that you have, then it's a pain to patch it. I mean, we've clearly seen it where if you have Exchange on premise, when there's a vulnerability, it is a race to patch it, and there's a lot of problems with it. So if it's a hosted service, that's something you don't have to worry about. So that's a very positive opportunity cost there.
All right, another one here. What is the importance of change management and training?
I'll leave this simply as hugely important and critical.
Distinct, I like it. Another one, how do you keep up with the 0-day and states actors in terms of control of integrity?
Okay, well, 0 days, I mean, you got to keep up with the CVE bulletins. Obviously, that's the answer. But the thing is, maybe if it's 0 day, obviously, I don't have a ZVE for it out immediately. So really, the only thing I'd suggest is you have to do it indirectly. I mean, if you use something like the MITRE attack framework to identify attack patterns, that'd probably be the way to go. So the vulnerabilities will change, but the attack patterns the adversaries will use are going to be more consistent. So, they'll be exploiting vulnerabilities, but they'll be doing so in a similar way. So, I mean, that's it. You have to really look at the human side of these, state actors or other nefarious actors. They use patterns. So let's identify those patterns and, try to account for those. Because, again, even as vulnerabilities change, if you can identify a pattern, you can take action against that pattern.
I'd just like to go back real quick to the question about the importance of training. I agree with you 100%, Ryan, but my issue is with how training is conducted. Juvenile videos with intentionally confusing questions, which is oftentimes what you see. I don't think that really does much to help people understand what their responsibilities are. If you're relying on 15 to 30-minute training sessions, how much of that can you legitimately get done over the course of a year while people are still trying to do their work? There are some really interesting training solutions that sort of go against the grain. It's based on science called nudge theory, which is essentially artificial intelligence that runs behind the scenes that anticipates that you're about to send a credit card number in the clear over email or something like that. So it nudges you. The system then nudges you to ask you or to let you know that you're about to violate a policy or do something that goes against. Here's a suggestion for how you should go about doing that instead. So I don't know where it ends up. Where we are today, I think, is just a bit antiquated. I think it's not efficient, and technologies like nudge theory might be a suggestion for how we could do things better and differently in the future.
So it's like basically super, DLP that helps you rather than just blocks you.
And it's not just DLP, because it's not just about data transmission outside of the enterprise. That's just one example that I use. So it's basically robots running behind the scenes, monitoring behavior to let you know when you should do something to stay on the good side of a policy.
Yeah, that's That's pretty cool. I have to find out more about that. The other thing is there's two kinds of training. I mean, I was assuming training from your professional point of view, like your cyber teams, but there's training for everybody and
Ah,
then specialized training. So it's critical for everybody. But the point is,
yep,
if you got people that or need to be experts in these, make sure they get trained. And learn by doing is always the best way.
Absolutely. We'll just do a couple more of these questions. I know we're a little past 3 o'clock, so if you need to drop off, please feel welcome to. And thank you for attending. But I'll go on to this one. Managing external risks such as supply chain and open source software. Learning how to be accountable. Will there be a way to manage against a system?
Okay, well, I mean, accountability for supply chain, I'd say, is holding your suppliers accountable at contract time. Direct enforcement's not possible like your own organization, but it can be accounted for in your B2B contracts. So, I mean, that's what I'd say against like the supply chain risk is making sure your suppliers do things in a secure way. I mean, likewise with open source software, you can do security checks against it, or there's the classic example is Red Hat. It's open source software, but it's a paid version. It's something you pay for it because they put additional security on it. So even with open source, there's people that you can pay that provide security for it.
I agree. It's part of the procurement process, and whether it becomes a certification, demonstrate that you meet these minimum standards on a continuous basis or not. I mean, maybe that's where it ends up having to go. Kind of like the DoD with CMMC. It's not supply chain; it's more vendor risk, but similar concept.
All right, and we'll do this last question here. Again, if your question wasn't addressed during this presentation, we'll still be reaching out to you. So this last question, can you address some of the growing complexities of the tools?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say Exacta.io offers a way to integrate multiple tools into a single pane of glass. So this reduces the complexity of operationalizing the data into actionable information. So we can provide a list of current integrations with that if you need. But if you have a growing complexity of tools, it's really putting them in one place is the answer. And then, Rick, are there any we want to highlight as far as integrations with the I/O? Or
Well, I mean, there's dozens of things that we've integrated: security tooling and cloud services and various technologies. And basically we deal with it as a customer requires something, as opposed to just build an integration and not really have a need for it, because everything has to be tested when you release a new version. So we're more responsive to customer requests, but with an API and SDK, it makes life a lot easier to add new integrations as they're needed.
yeah, but I'm just thinking of the ones we currently have, like the big ones. So.
Yeah, the Qualys and Tenable and Tanium and Symantec and McAfee and Tripwire. There's dozens of them.
Yep. Alrighty,
Awesome.
I think I'll leave it at that.
Absolutely. So thank you again, Rick and Ryan, for joining us today and giving us that presentation. And thank all of you for attending and joining. For more information about anything discussed during the presentation, we'll have sales contacts available for you. We'll reach out with a recording of this webinar next week, or visit our website in the meantime, telos.com. Thanks and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you for your time.